So we're 70 years behind what should have happened naturally because we're all learning that there's every reason to appreciate each other, right? But we're just now starting to appreciate that, and we need to start building our city so that we can start living that way.
I've met Dennis a couple of times. I think it's and Julie as well at a couple of Adam Hawley's events, which a lot of you have joined in over the years. And Adam does a great job with those. But I haven't actually seen this presentation, but Adam has. And as soon as it was over, he called and said, "You got to see this. You're going to love it." And I think it's very timely when we look at the changes that we were Dennis and I were just talking about. There's so much change that's accelerating now with work from home and where work is going to be and where people might live, how we're going to shop, and where stores might be. That we're in the middle of something rapidly transforming that isn't at the end. It's we've got several years of it ahead of us. So Dennis's look back at the past and the lessons of the past, I think, can help all of us, with business and community, think about how do we shape this going forward. So I'll hand it off to Dennis, and then if you have questions as we go along, type them in the chat, and then when Dennis is done, we can run through the questions.
Randy, thank you for the opportunity, and good morning, everyone. Um, so I'm going to show you a presentation. I'm going to try and go through it in about 30 minutes because what's most valuable is the discussion that it generates. We have a planning studio at Gould Evans, and Gould Evans has been around almost 50 years, and we've had our planning studio for the last 30. And we work with communities around the country on comprehensive planning, development planning, those kinds of things. And about 5 years ago, we started understanding some challenges that all of our cities were facing, and have started changing the way that we work with communities. And this presentation is specifically intended to have a conversation with our Kansas City because it's a different way of understanding the world. And it's a hurdle that we feel like we need to get over in order for us to start making progress again on how we build our city. So I'll tell you this, I'm really glad I have this opportunity to share this with everybody on the call because we're working on getting it right. And we welcome feedback, observations, questions, because we're trying to create a dialogue, and we're, again, trying to redirect the direction that the world's been going for some time now. I'm going to start with a preview of what we'll get to eventually. But I'll put everything in a context. One way that we can think about our city is as a property management company. And if you think of our city that way, then all of a sudden our city becomes the largest corporation in the area, because this corporation manages almost $30 billion in assets. If you consider all the private investment that makes up Kansas City, Missouri, that's what the corporation of Kansas City, Missouri manages. And we don't think about it that way. We don't think about Kansas City being a larger enterprise than Cerner or Garmin and these places that in a lot of ways we think about are drivers of the economy. That's a healthy way to start this discussion, particularly with business people. When we talk with communities, we don't necessarily go down that place, but with this group, I think that's a good place to start. This is where we're heading, and I'll come back to this, but this is a map that has a new way for us to understand our city. And again, I'll get to this in a moment, but I'm going to take you through a couple of 101 courses first. And the first one is City Building 101. So you're going to learn everything you need to know about city building in 2 minutes. So we've been building cities as people for 3,000 years. And if you look across the world, in all types of cultures and civilizations and geographies, you find that we as humans were reaching similar conclusions in terms of how to shape places for civilization, for large gatherings of people to share commerce. So these photos are from places all around the world that show similar outcomes, even though dramatically different contexts. And you can track that same phenomenon here in Kansas City, Missouri, starting with our beginnings down on the Missouri River as a village of just 1,000 people or so. And this is in 1850. And 80 years later, so, you know, a lifetime later, but only 80 years later, I'll say, we got to this point where we had a thriving downtown, we had a bustling street life, we had an impressive streetcar system, and we had a skyline that we could brag about. And we also had a pretty impressive welcome center that we built for ourselves that we all still enjoy today, right, in terms of Union Station. Most of us are aware of the Parks and Boulevard system. What we don't always think about is that Kansas City benefits from having a framework based on design that gives our city character. So we're unique in that way. Another thing that we don't think about anymore is that at one point, this is again 80 years after we were a village, we had 100 miles of streetcar. So I'm pausing to let that sink in a second, because you know that we have a few miles now, and you know the struggle it took us over the last 20 years to get there. But by the 1930s, we had 100 miles of streetcar serving a city that that supported all of that. And it wasn't because we had campaigns and public debates about should we build streetcars. It was only because our first 80 years of Kansas City was following the previous 3,000 years of city building lessons. Because over those 3,000 years, there are lots of lessons learned, and we just kept getting better and better at building cities. And by the time Kansas City came along, we followed the patterns that preceded us, and we quickly turned into the city that we all saw, which is, to me, amazing that we were able to do what we did within that first 80 years. So that was the City Building 101 lesson. This is a little bit of Civics 101. Since the founding of our country, we've had a motivation baked into our public policy for people to become property owners. This is based on the premise that, for one thing, we're an experiment as a government, right? We're a collection of, in theory, we're supposed to be a collection of self-governing individuals that preserve our freedoms by that self-governance. Well, the founding fathers knew that was an experiment and knew it was going to be a tricky thing to perpetuate because there weren't any governments like that in the past. So the thought was we need independent people to drive that idea and carry that idea forward. And the most independent people at that time were property owners. So if we make more and more people property owners, we're more likely to have the independence we need to maintain a self-governing form of governance. So from the beginning, we had baked in incentives to encourage us to become property owners. If you can start even with Thomas Jefferson's invention of the metes and bounds survey system, which quickly subdivided the entire country and made it easy to sell it off and parcel it off and to make it available to, you know, a dramatic increase in ownership. And then you get into the 1800s, we had the Railroad Expansion Act, we had the Homesteading Act, which my grandparents benefited from. You may know folks who benefited from the Homesteading Act. We get into the 1900s, and by that time, still most of us didn't own our own home. Most of us were still renters. So the government created the 30-year mortgage. We may not know that generally, but it was the government that allowed us to go from 5 to 10-year mortgages, which was all that were available prior to the government subsidizing a 30-year mortgage program, which made home ownership available to a much broader segment of the population. And then, of course, we had the Second World War, which created the largest baby boom, which is really the largest real estate market, if you want to look at it that way, that we'd ever seen. Then we decided we needed an interstate highway system, so we built an entirely new way of accessing our country. And all these things were setting us up for the big disruptor, right? The big difference that was going to change the way that we built cities from that point forward. And this is what that disruptor looks like, right? Now we all are pretty familiar with these now because we've grown up with them. But by 1950, it was the first time in our history that most American families owned one of these. And the important thing from a city building perspective is that, oh, and I'll put a caveat here. When I say most Americans, most of the front end of this presentation is talking about the majority of us. There's another story I'll tell towards the end that had a totally different impact on minority communities, but I'll come back to that. Prior to 1950, we were motivated to build cities in such a way that we could get close together. That was the whole idea, was to share resources, share amenities, share commerce, be close to the grocery store, be close to work, close to school. All those things were really important with the way that we had learned to build cities. And the more people we could get together, the more vibrant and vital those communities were. But by 1950, by the time we had one of these, each family had one of these, the idea of proximity changed completely, because now the definition of close changed, because 15 miles could be achieved in 15 minutes. So close wasn't the same thing anymore. And you can see the footprint that left. This is the first 100 years of Kansas city building. In a map form, a simple map. So we're looking down at the Missouri River and seeing the village on the river and seeing that area in gray, which is the growth after 100 years. By that time, we were 500,000 people living in 80 square miles. And again, a very robust and prosperous city, able to afford to build Union Station and other, we built our parks with lavish monumentation and fountains. We were a prosperous community by 1950. This is us today, 100 years later, 70 years later, I'm sorry. 7 years later, we have grown to a city that's nearly 4 times that size, having 319 square miles of city now. But for a whole lot of complicated reasons, we are still about a city of 500,000 people, which means that each of us now has 4 times as much city to be responsible for, right? That's the simple math of it, because we've spread out so much, but we don't have many more people helping us pay for it. So now each of us has 4 times than our predecessors did in 1950. If that were the case, we'd leave it there, but there's a company that is helping people understand their cities this way, and I'll talk about them. They're Urban 3 out of Asheville, North Carolina. They do these maps that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but they also do studies like this that show that not only did we dramatically increase the amount of city that we had per person, we dramatically increased the amount of infrastructure per person, because we build our infrastructure more intensely than we used to. Our streets are wider, we have more fire hydrants, we have things like sewer lift stations where we pump our sewage. We never used to do that. So we have a much more expensive and inextensive infrastructure system. In many cases, they're finding that compared to 1950, each citizen now has as much as 10 times more infrastructure that they're liable for. So it's a dramatically different world than it was 70 years ago. So I'll use an example to help us understand that. And just talk about streets, because we all understand streets. We see them all the time, and we drive on them and use them. This is a map of Kansas City street system. It shows all the streets. In red are post 1950 and black before. If you stretched all those streets out and just created a lane, a single driving lane, you could go from New York to San Francisco, and you could turn around and pave a lane all the way back to New York and still have enough left over that you could take the weekend off in Portland, Maine, and then come back to New York, and you would have built Kansas City by then. So imagine all that street and trying to plow it overnight so that you get the kids to school and the buses the next day. It's an amazing amount of infrastructure that we built. You can put a price to that infrastructure and generally identify that we've got about $5 billion worth of streets that we built. Um, and streets will last about 50 years if you ask civil engineers. They'll last that long if you take care of them. But if they're going to last 50 years, then you need to put aside replacement cost. And 50 billion over 50 years is about $100 million a year that we ought to be putting aside for replacement. And then we also need to add to that the maintenance requirements to keep them, functional for 50 years. And by the time you do that, you've got $124 million annually of liability that we have just for our street system, right? And again, I'm only talking about streets in this discussion. We have other forms of infrastructure, and I'm not even getting into other forms of public service, but $124 million a year is how much we should be setting aside for that street system. Now, the Public Works Department maintains a pretty good log of how the condition our streets are in. And they will tell you that nearly half of our streets have either failed or are about to fail. And they reported last year to the city council that we really need to be spending $166 million a year to get our streets back into a fair condition. Not a great condition or a good condition, but a fair condition. So we're needing $166 million a year to get back on top of our streets. That's roughly 10 times how much we budgeted last year, and actually more. We budgeted less this year for our street preservation. So we're underfunding that part of our infrastructure by an order of magnitude, right? Let me look at another example just to continue with this discussion in terms of the problems that we've made. This is the way we've generally built our city since 1950, since we had the big disruptor and all of us can get around so much easier now. If you take this neighborhood and you measure all the streets and you apportion them to all the homes in the neighborhood, you find that each house in this example needs about 136 feet of street to come and go to that house every day. Then you go back to our measurements, and that means that house has a liability of $657,000 or $657 a year to take care of its share of our Kansas City street system. So we'll use an example of that house being worth $250,000. If you go through all the tax calculations and figure out how we set up our budgets and everything, what you find is that that house is generating about $94 a year that could go towards street preservation, which is nowhere near the $657,000 or $657 liability that house has. So we're out of whack, right? That we have a problem there. So let's look at a different form of housing. This being an urban form of housing. And because it's urban, it has 14 units that in total only need 50 feet of street. So just by the nature of being urban, it's a much more efficient style of housing, right? 37 times more efficient than the example on the right. But for whatever reason, we've decided that we're going to tax both homes the same amount. Again, if you live in a $250,000 home on the left or a $250,000 home on the right, you're paying the same property taxes because of the way that we choose to tax ourselves. Even though the one on the left is 37 times more efficient, which means, by the way, that the one on the left actually pays more property taxes than it needs to take care of that little amount of street that it needs. So the one on the left is generating money back to the city for the city to do other things with, right? It's a win on the ledger. The one on the right is an annual loser on that ledger. That's costing the city significantly for every home that's in that condition. And we have lots of homes in that condition. And we don't recognize the disparity there in the way that we tax ourselves. So to be fair, that's comparing an urban condition to a low density neighborhood. So let's just compare neighborhood to neighborhood. And let's use the white line in the middle of this slide as 1950 and compare the pre-1950 neighborhoods on the left to the post-1950 neighborhoods on the right. So you'll see that in terms of street pattern and in terms of lot size, that just those two things which were driven again prior to 1950 by this motivation to be close together. But they made our neighborhoods 3 times more efficient than the way we built them since 1950, now that we can get around more easy. But that wasn't the only thing that we did prior to 1950. We also are very familiar in Kansas City, when you drive throughout our historic neighborhoods, with these kinds of multifamily buildings. These were the apartment complexes of the 1900s. And we also had duplexes, triplexes, we had carriage houses, we had all sorts of boarding houses, people that would rent out apartments. All those things made those neighborhoods much more productive. 6 or 7 times more productive in terms of the amount of properties and the value of private investment that those neighborhoods generated compared to the neighborhoods on the right. If you track that out using the $250,000 home, you can see that the amount of private investment on the left is dramatically different than the amount of private investment on the right, even though the infrastructure, the amount of yellow dashed lines in there is pretty similar. You've built about the same amount of infrastructure to serve both conditions, but your return on that infrastructure investment is dramatically different. Now, an interesting point to make at this point is that the neighborhood on the left is a very common neighborhood throughout our pre-1950 Kansas City areas. Brookside, Roanoke, most of our neighborhoods in the Midtown area and east of Troost look like this. So let's talk about the east of Troost neighborhoods for a minute, where the average home value is easily, in many areas, it's $50,000. Because of the efficiency of the land use pattern, those $50,000 homes in those efficient neighborhoods are generating as much private investment as the more contemporary neighborhoods on the post-1950 side of this slide. Those pre-1950 neighborhoods, those neighborhoods we consider to be lower income, lower value, in many cases, charity cases, are as valuable to our city as the ones that we think about being the affluent neighborhoods, the ones that are driving the economy, the ones that are making a difference for our city. And it's because we misunderstand how our city works. So with all those points on the table, we do think we need to change course. And we've got 3 general ways that we're suggesting that we look at things differently. Now that we understand this phenomenon of having so much city per person that we're responsible for, and that we have so much street that we are underfunding by a magnitude of 10, because we just can't afford to take care of all this infrastructure, we should be very careful about building any more infrastructure, right? Particularly if we're building in patterns that we know are losing us money for every neighborhood like this that we build. It's just making us more in debt every time we build another situation like this, another situation where the return on the public investment in the form of private investment doesn't generate enough tax revenue to pay for the public's investment. So we should be very careful about doing any more of that. And it's still predominantly the way that we're building our city, by the way. Okay, the next problem is that we're upside down in budget, right? We struggled this year just to find money for potholes, and potholes are a superficial issue relevant to the fundamental issue of street deterioration that we're facing across the city. The little red sliver here is how much we put into street maintenance last year. It's about the same thing this year, and we need 10 times that much. And you can imagine going around to all the other city programs and departments and saying, I need to borrow $150 million from you. You know, it's not going to happen. It's a discussion we should start having, but it's just not there. So instead of that, we could be moving forward with city policies that help us build the pie, right? To build more return on investment so we have more resources so we can get our books back in order, back in balance. So finally, I'm getting us to this map. So this is a map by that group called Urban 3 out of Asheville that they're producing for cities now all around the country. Once we learned about them, we started on a campaign to try and get get their work funded here in Kansas City. So we had the benefit of this information. And fortunately, last year, the Kauffman Foundation, as part of their efforts to help Kansas City understand what's going to happen to our opportunity zone neighborhoods, because that was a big unknown when it came out of the federal government, they thought it'd be helpful to have this information. So they funded Urban 3 to do this study for us. And what this map shows us that's new is the value of our city on a per acre basis. So this is both a heat map and it's also a three-dimensional map. So the heat map side of it is from green to purple. It goes from very low value to very high value properties on a per acre basis. And then the three-dimensional piece of it, you can see the purple is spiking up. And the green, if we looked at this in relief, you'd see that it's flat. So that's how the map works. I'm going to look at it now in 2 dimensions, just looking down on it. And I'm going to explain why it's different, because we're used to looking at our city value in terms of the value per parcel. So, you know, we go back to that $250,000 home. That's how we think of that piece of the value of Kansas City. That's a $250,000 property. But that's not a very good way to measure it if you're trying to understand the return on investment of your public infrastructure. So this map shows the value per parcel. This next map shows the value per acre. It's a different way of looking at the city. So I'll stay with the $250,000 home. If that $250,000 home is on a 1/4 acre lot, then you can build 4 of those $250,000 homes on an acre, and you've built $1 million worth of private investment on that acre. Now, if you took that same $250,000 home and put it on a 5-acre lot, your return is $50,000 an acre. That's a dramatic swing in terms of the return on the public investment, but we don't measure that in terms of where we're creating wealth and the kind of wealth that we're creating around the community to help us pay for all the things that we've built over the last 70 years. And that's why it's necessary to look at our city differently and not see it in the traditional per parcel way, but to see it in this new per acre way. You can see how different these maps turn out as heat maps when you start understanding it that way. Because on a per acre base, you start to see where the real value generation is happening in Kansas City and where the real loss, the real leakage is happening too. So the way the map works, again, the property on the left that we saw was so productive, it shows up in dark red up to purple because it's returning more money than we need to pay for its share of the infrastructure, and it's creating good for the community. Whereas the ones on the right are that cool green color that are actually costing us money. The thing we don't understand and talk about is it's actually subsidized housing because it's not generating enough value to pay for its existence. So the city is paying for that form of housing. Just think about it that way for a little while. If we look again at our pre-1950 and post-1950 neighborhoods, again, with the $50,000 homes average on the left and the 250 on the right, they're both generating about the same value back to the city. And part of the reason why there's the same value, even with the vast discrepancy in home value, is because of that diversity of housing, right? There's so much more opportunity for so many more properties in that pre-1950s neighborhood that it's much more valuable. It's one of the lessons that we need to learn. The reason that we don't have affordable housing is because we quit building in the way that we used to build our neighborhoods. We used to build a wide variety of housing all throughout our city. That was everything from single family homes to duplexes to triplexes and multiplex housing. And over the time, those homes would be in different conditions. And all those things would create different price points, different opportunities for people of different incomes to be able to afford to be in those neighborhoods and to be near those jobs, to be near those amenities, to be near those other people that you might choose to be near because our neighborhood supported diversity. We've segregated that out of the way we build neighborhoods. And not only has it cost us economically with this example on the slide, it's cost us in terms of our race relations, because it's a primary contributor to why we remain segregated today. And it's part of a current discussion. All we have to do to improve the value of our post 1950 neighborhoods is to build these scary things. These are the scary things that everybody refers to as multifamily housing, that people resist because they don't want those people living in our neighborhoods. It's a sickness that we've developed over time that we need to recognize the symptoms of and get beyond, because these things are not problems. These things are making our city valuable by increasing the return on public investment out of the private investment that we generate. And we need to become much more understanding of this and be doing a lot more of this style of housing all throughout our city. So the other, and this is the adult conversation part of this, the other most challenging part is probably going back and facing the tax problem that we have because of this disparity that we've created. Our tax property, our property tax system is based on primarily the value of the improvements on a piece of land, not the location of that piece of land. In general, all throughout the country, the amount you pay in property tax is a factor of 80 or 90% based on the value of the improvements, again, the structure that you built. And very little of it is based on the locational value. That motivates inefficient behavior, right? Because it doesn't cost you more to live in a much more inefficient way, which might offer more amenity for people, but it's amenity again that we're subsidizing because of the way that we've allowed our city to be built, and it's encouraged by our property tax system. So that same property tax system allows our most valuable property. Back when we were looking at that value per acre map, we saw downtown. It was that peaked up purple area that was spiking property value because that's where our best investments have been. That's where our most valuable land is. But in that most valuable part of Kansas City, we have parking lots, which is one of the least productive forms of real estate development. Now, it doesn't make any sense until you understand the dynamics of property tax, because property tax encourages you to be an owner of that property and to hold it if you can, because you're not paying a lot for it because there's not any improvements to speak of on it. And you can hold it for a significant amount of time while the city around you continues to build in value. And then some time in the future, you can choose to cash out. Well, what we don't appreciate enough in our society is that what's happening in that case is we're letting a speculator cash out, taking the value that our city has built, that 170 years of Kansas City investment, 170 years of people building their city have created the value of this most valuable part of our city. And we're letting speculators take it away from us and put it in their pocket and walk away. And that's why we have parking lots downtown. If that property that has a parking lot on it was valued based on its location, that property owner would be motivated to do something with it. They'd be motivated to improve it, to make it worth something so that they could generate enough resources to afford to own that valuable piece of property. But our property tax system doesn't do that. Another problem with the property tax system is the example on the right, which most of us are familiar with. These are disinvested homes in areas where somebody can buy a house and just let it fall apart. Because again, if the property tax is largely based on the value of the improvements, then you're not motivated to keep the improvements very high. You want it to be as low as possible because your goal is to sit on that property until the neighborhood around you is worth something and then you cash out again. The problem is these absentee landlords have brought down our neighborhoods all throughout our city in this practice, which is encouraged by the way that we tax ourselves. So those are the three recommendations: to be really careful about building more infrastructure, to be much more appreciative of the value that small scale multifamily builds into our city and the opportunities it creates for affordable housing throughout our city. And then the last thing is that we need to we need to have taxation and expenses that more reflect the cost to our city for the types of development that we do. So I've spent most of this time talking about streets because it's easier for us all to talk about streets. But let's talk about police protection for a minute. That's a current fun topic. The chart here is the same map. It's showing, or the same chart, it's showing cities the size of Kansas City. And on the left-hand side, the amount we spend per police on a per capita basis, where Kansas City is in the top quartile there. We do very well on a per capita basis in terms of investing in our police department. On the right-hand side is that same measure, but on a per square mile basis. And you can see the geography has an impact on even police protection, right? Because we don't rank nearly as well compared to our peer cities in terms of a per square mile measurement of our police protection. And we expect police protection throughout our city. We don't just expect it, in a certain area. So we're paying for that entire city, and we're paying a lot for some of the lowest level of service because of our spreading out so much. So I told you I'd get back to the disparity problem. I'll talk about that for a minute here. This map again shows the economic engine of Kansas City being downtown and the neighborhoods that lie between the river and 75th Street and State Line and Troost Avenue. Those are the warmest colored properties on this map. They are the best return on investments that we have in Kansas City, Missouri. That 5% of our city generates 20% of our tax income. And you can measure it in terms of sales tax and earnings tax, and you'll find the same disparity. It's about 20% of the revenue our city gets comes out of that 5% of the city. So we know what happens in Kansas City. We've all grown up with this. There's that yellow line in the middle of this map. This is actually a close-up of that value per acre map. That yellow line is Troost Avenue. And we all know about Troost Avenue, and we all know that the property values on the left-hand side of this map, or on the west side of Troost, are significantly higher than the property values on the right-hand side. 10 times as much in many cases. And now this is the real estate 101 lesson. This is all you need to know about real estate, right? Real estate is driven by value. Value is driven by the value the community's created around that particular address. Our community has created the most valuable part of our city in that 16 square miles that I outlined between the river and 75th Street. And right next to that, the property value drops by 10 times, which is totally counterintuitive to everything we know about real estate development. That development on the right-hand side of Troost, on the east side of Troost, is the exact same development style, the exact same housing stock that built all those valuable neighborhoods west of Troost. And this is the reason why it is not as valuable. It's because of redlining that we've all heard about, many of us understand. Redlining was the way that when the government created the 30-year mortgage, you had to get an appraisal to back up that 30-year mortgage. And the government paid, we all paid for appraisers to create programs to identify where you could get good appraisals and where you couldn't. And that's where redlining came from. All those redline neighborhoods were identified as not being worthy of 30-year mortgages. So none of those communities could participate in that new way of wealth building that most of us got to benefit from. And if you go through our civics lesson again, as many incentives that we baked into our laws and governance and culture over the last 250 years to encourage the majority of us to be property owners, at the same time, we were creating laws and practices and cultural traditions that were keeping minority communities, particularly African Americans, from participating in that same form of wealth building. So at one time, we were pouring gas on the flames and encouraging development. On the other side, we are throwing water on the flames and we're keeping entire parts of our community down. There's a book that's was published recently by Richard Rothstein, called The Color of Law. And what he's done is gone through and he's recorded over the last 100 years all the laws that were in place that restricted African American communities from participating in city building and wealth building that, again, we've all felt as normal over the last 70 years. In fact, Richard Rothstein identifies 15 different laws, 15 different ways in which African Americans were kept from benefiting from real estate development. And that's why this disparity sits there, right? So that's the sad history. The good part of the history is we now are talking about that, right? We're having this discussion today. You've all had lots of discussions over the last 2 months in particular because of the focus now on social justice. But even before COVID and the current protest, our civic communities, our civic council, our chamber, downtown council, the chamber or the council, everybody was starting to talk about shared prosperity. We were starting to recognize that it is time for us to address that. So I'm putting all this together and suggesting that one of our best opportunities to go forward as a city is not only to be much wiser about how we invest our public resources towards return on private investment, but we do that in ways that it can help to rebuild equity. This is that map we saw before, the 50,000 versus $250,000 homes, the neighborhoods on the left, which are our central city neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods that we built since 1950 on the right. The left-hand side of this equation, those $50,000 homes could easily go to $150,000 properties. It's happening already. There are broaches in that line of Troost all around Rutgers University, all around 35th Street near the Squire Park neighborhood, the Beacon Hill neighborhood. Those areas are starting to see investment happen because younger families are seeing the value there. They aren't stuck with all the stigmas that the rest of the world's been dealing with, and they're seeing that value and they're starting to invest. And it's very reasonable to expect that those properties could triple in value because a $150,000 home is still it's a great value in the United States, right? And they have that location going for them. So it's very reasonable to see that happening. It's not very reasonable to think that we're going to double or triple the value of the private development on the right-hand side of the equation unless we change the development pattern and we start doing more types of housing within those post-1950 neighborhoods. So our greatest opportunity for good return on investment is in the same areas that we've caused disinvestment for the last 70 years. But once I say that, I need to also point out that gentrification is real, right? This map shows that red line now of Troost, and it shows the inflation that's already recorded happening to the east of Troost, where property values are starting to inflate in value, and that's the fundamental cause of displacement, is where people can no longer afford to live somewhere because their property taxes are increasing or the cost of living is increasing dramatically. So we're about to do another injustice to the folks that we've impoverished to a certain part of our town, and we could fix that, but we need to fix it now because there are plenty of policies that we can put into place that allow for people to gradually move into property ownership or gradually adjust to increasing property values and not be displaced on a immediate due to the immediate impact of reinvestment that we can already see is happening. But we don't have those policies in place. We don't have this understanding in place that in order for our underserved communities to benefit this time from city building, we need to help them graduate into it and not displace them out of the way. The other thing that we have going for us is that we all chose 3 or 4 years ago to vote in this $800 million general obligations bond. That bond gave us the opportunity to reinvest in our infrastructure. Unfortunately, we are doing that in a political way rather than a strategic way. If we aligned those $800 million towards strategic reinvestment that we know would create return on investment, we could start to build our way out of the hole and start increasing that pie so we have resources to address our problems. but we're not doing that yet. And we need to be talking more seriously about that. The other thing we have going for us is that we're under a $5 billion court order to fix our combined sewer systems in our central city. That's not a great place to be in, but we don't have a choice. The good news is we're starting to make these kinds of green infrastructure improvements that are going to have lasting value rather than just being concrete pipes under the ground. But we could do better because we could align these investments with strategic real estate investments to make them even more overall strategic investments. So we have these things that we could start lining up as a city, and we could work our way forward to get ourselves out of the hole that we dug ourselves into over the last 70 years. But we need to understand what got us there and what can get us back out. And that's the discussion that we're encouraging to have. And Randy, I apologize, I spent too much time talking today because I'm to the point now where I really want to open it up for Q&A, and I don't know how much time we have left.
This is fascinating, Dennis. And, you know, a couple things that come to mind. One, we've got folks on here from Indiana and Oklahoma and Nashville, and I'm assuming the map would look a lot like any of those cities that you went to. This isn't a Kansas City problem. It's how we do things problem, right?
That is right, and I appreciate you pointing that out because I usually make a point of that. It's Kansas City's not unique in that way. Unfortunately, we're one of the poster childs because of how much we spread out over the last 70 years. We're very much like Oklahoma City and Memphis and some other cities that have done the same thing. But all cities, even our little Lawrence, Kansas over next door, has some of that problem that they're fighting. So it's a prevalent problem throughout the country.
Yeah, I see Mike on here from Omaha and Council Bluffs. That's all one big blur. I know I used to ride through Franklin south of Nashville, and that was horse farms out in the country. And it's not anymore. From Franklin to the Kentucky line is filled in. You know, this focused on residential, but I'm assuming there's a healthy mix of business that you strive for. And you know, I'm down in Lewisburg, and I watch Overland Parks march towards Tulsa. They keep coming one street at a time, closer and closer. You don't have the right mix as residents leave KC and come south. You end up with towns like Lewisburg where it's all residential and less business, and maybe KC is more business and less residential. How do you map out what's the right kind of mix for that?
Well, I'm going to say that the thing we haven't paid attention to that we should have always kept our eye on is the residential side of the equation, because it's the primary way we use our land, right? It's like 90% of our land is residential. It's some giant amount of it. And we've focused more on commercial development as cities. That's how we've focused our attention, our efforts. Most of our regulations and laws and public debates are built around commercial investments. But it's the residential investment that fundamentally drives the shape of the city. So that same phenomenon of low intensity land use, if you look at commercial properties, it has the same problem. It's not generating enough return to justify all the acreage that it takes up. And you're right, I didn't go into that today, but I'll just share that it has the same problem as the residential piece of the equation. And we are intentionally trying to focus on residential because that part of city building is fundamental to the strength of the overall city.
Dennis, you know, when you look at the budget that the cities are putting into road repairs and things, as a business person, the first thing that goes in my mind is there's got to be a technology to decrease the cost, increase the lifespan of the repairs. It seems to me that's the only way forward to sort of balance out the two, because I think the costs are just becoming so prohibitive to repair roads. Is there anything out there that are cities looking at that, or is that just something that they're leaving their budgeting based on old historic data that says this is the cost of repair?
Well, we certainly build in a much more technologically advanced way than we used to build in terms of our streets even. The profiling, the subsurface development, the nature of the pavement is much more sophisticated than it ever used to be. So in that regards, we are benefiting from new technologies, and our streets do probably last longer than they used to before. Um, and then you can add new smart technology that you hear about a lot that is putting sensors into roadways. You can get a sense about deterioration, road uses, all those things. But fundamentally, we're still trying to maintain a street. And I'm not aware of any totally new revolutionary ways of street building or maintenance that are going to dramatically change that cost of maintenance in the near term. And again, something like that might show up, but for what we know today, the cost of maintaining our streets is still something that we're substantially behind in addressing.
I was just more making an observation. Nashville used Kansas City as a model for its streetcar process. I've worked with our Metro Council with sustainable development education programs and worked with a fellow named Kite Singleton there um, that some of you may know. But I think it's interesting how Kansas City is facing the same challenges that we're having. And in some areas, you're more progressive than cities like Nashville or Louisville. I'm curious if you have thought about public-private partnerships as an opportunity. I worked for a large infrastructure company based in London, where it's much more common over there to do like street lighting, private funding for things like that. And you get away from being dependent on the tax base. So I'm curious if Kansas City is doing anything regarding that.
So I don't know. There may be. I have to admit that's not a question I've gotten before. So I don't know if there are examples of public-private investments in infrastructure. Some things I can point out is that one council person pointed out to me that he has a neighborhood in Kansas City that is a newer subdivision, but one particular part of it has a private street system,
Mhm.
and they keep lobbying to become part of the public street network because of the cost of maintaining their private street. So we did a study and we looked at the tax revenue generation for that private situation and advised the councilman that you don't want to take that investment because it's only going to cost more for the city. It's not generating enough value to justify it. And poor property owners in that case, they got on the wrong side of the ledger here. Most other property owners benefit from the city taking that on.
Right.
And the city doesn't benefit because we haven't recognized how costly that has been for us.
Yeah,
Uh,
streets are really hard to get your money back, but some of the things you were talking about with the infrastructure, like water or anything that you could collect a fee, is
yeah,
needed.
that there is an opportunity there. This is kind of an obtuse reference, but our firm does a lot of work with higher education. University of Missouri's Rolla campus, the science and technology campus, went through and kind of being who they are, they created a geothermal heating system for the entire campus, which is very energy efficient and a smart long-term investment for them. But they had to tear up the entire campus to put it in, right? It was a fairly costly investment. Well, while they were tearing up the campus, they recognized that they could replace all their water piping. So they decided to add, the cost of replacing the water piping into the project. What they found was that additional cost for water pipe replacement saved them so much in lost water that was just leaking out of an old system that they paid for it within a few years.
Wow.
And that kind of payback is something private industry is interested in participating in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there could be opportunities like that where there are service contracts that allow for those things to be addressed, but ultimately we're still going to be faced with somebody's got to pay that bill, right? So private industry may help us pay the bill, but there's still going to be a bill that's going to affect the cost of that infrastructure replacement. So it's an interesting idea that we should kick around to see if it could create opportunities.
Chantel, I unmuted you.
Thanks, Randy. Dennis, this was really interesting. This is not something that's typically in my wheelhouse of thought, so I enjoy learning something new. I had a couple of questions for you. The first is, I think most of us have seen this desire for a lot of maybe upper middle class people, especially, to build larger homes with more land. So how do you reconcile that desire for new homes with more land and the issue of developing more infrastructure? What strategies can you use there?
Well, our mistake, I'll put it that way, over the last 70 years is that we didn't really account for how much it costs to build that way. So we didn't really tax in such a way that that form of development was paying for what it cost to serve it over the years ahead. So we missed the boat, and now we're upside down and trying to figure out a way out of it. And all of us who made decisions on where we lived were making those decisions within that previous world where we didn't understand that. So it was a very logical choice. If you preferred all those aspects of suburban living, why not? So I do think ultimately for us to balance the books again, to get our ledger back in order, that it would mean that we would have to pay more for expensive styles of development. It just makes sense. We would all agree to that, right? We would all agree that more expensive things, we ought to be paying more for it. We just never knew they were more expensive. So it's kind of gentrification in the opposite way, right? It's not something that next year we're going to quadruple your property taxes. That's never going to happen. But there ought to be some grown-up discussion about incrementally moving over some period of time over the future towards a more balanced equation, because our city is subsidizing that side of the equation. We don't think about it that way. We all argue about incentives benefiting downtown and commercial developments, but we don't think about the fact that we're fundamentally subsidizing the majority of our city through the development patterns that we've encouraged. And it's a new way we need to talk about and understand our city in order to be informed at the level that'll allow us to make good decisions about how to go forward. So not at all saying we shouldn't have that style of housing, but am saying we should all pay for what we use.
Mm-hmm. So my second question is, so I live in a historical neighborhood in Nashville. And for me, the multifamily discussion is not about, the scary people moving into the neighborhood, because it's a multicultural neighborhood anyway. Mm-hmm. For me, it changes the visual of the neighborhood. It changes. So you have all these single family bungalows built in the 1920s, and it has this real charm in the neighborhood. And then someone will sell that quarter lot and put up, 3 skinny row houses. And it just changes the dynamic of the neighborhood. So what are your thoughts about that and in regard to historical neighborhoods?
Yeah. Taste is a challenge, right? Regulating taste has always been the biggest challenge that any government has had. Ultimately, you almost have to just go by pride of ownership. And if we didn't have so many overlays that made it hard to do any of this stuff, and you just recognize development based on good and bad, then I think you'd encourage a lot more good development, right? I'm saying this because there are plenty of ways you can build multifamily housing within single family neighborhoods that's completely comfortable. There's also plenty of ways you can build multifamily neighborhoods or housing into neighborhoods and it be disruptive and out of character, out of scale from all sorts of ways. So we know we can do that better. Whether we regulate that or just shame that into existence, I don't know, but there are good ways of doing that. And the important part of this presentation is just to help us all understand that by its nature, multifamily is necessary in order for us to afford our cities. And we wanted to think we could afford to regulate it out of existence, but we're now realizing that we couldn't. We ought to use examples like yours to point to, okay, this is not a good way of doing it, but look at these other 5 examples where there are good ways of doing it, and let's find more good ways of building our city and encourage that more.
And maybe it's part of it is, I mean, kind of looking at those neighborhoods and looking at opportunities on the edges of those neighborhoods, right?
Yeah, in our planning practice, that's one of the ways we go, is that there are strategies where you can coexist much easier, where you don't have disrupt or severe changes from one lot to the next about, you know, a 1-story bungalow and a 3-story multifamily building. But you can easily put those 1-story bungalows down the street, and on the end of the block facing the other street can be multifamily buildings, and they feel fine. They feel natural.
Yeah.
There are practices that you can incorporate that make from a planning perspective, that cohabitation much more comfortable.
Melissa, I've unmuted you. I think you got a great observation about not pricing people out of their home. You know, how do you do this and not price people out of their neighborhoods, particularly around Troost?
Yeah. I'll start the answer to that by saying we spent the last 70 years driving value down in those neighborhoods. And at the same time, we took all the value those neighborhoods represented and we used it to make other investments, right? So it wouldn't be wrong for us to start reinvesting in those neighborhoods. And it wouldn't be wrong for us to look at a very long term for that reinvestment and to give those neighborhoods not only time to adjust to those new property values. In some cases, you need to provide training to adjust to home ownership. Those fundamental skills aren't necessarily shared by everybody. But the other part of the equation is recognizing that we need to create job opportunities. Wealth building is not just real estate; it's also having access to work. And we're not very thoughtful in that regard about how we encourage where businesses locate relative to where housing is to support those businesses in terms of the labor force. We could be a lot more strategic about that. And I'll tell you that the Area Transportation Authority, the KCATA, is doing a great job of putting good thinking together to help us go forward in a much more organized way in that regard. So it's a complex question that I think deserves our effort to work through and to help those communities participate this time around in wealth building. And it's going to take time, and it's going to take more than just real estate policy to get there.
I think Mary's got some similar questions here around affordable housing.
Well, good morning, everybody. Dennis, this has been quite fascinating. I've learned a lot, and I will definitely be looking into the book to learn more. My question was, where does affordable housing fit in the value acre model?
Yeah. My position on affordable housing is that we've regulated it out of existence. So I mentioned some of this during the presentation, but over the last 70 years, as we started spreading out, we created new land use regulations. Single family zoning is not an age-old way of city building. It's a 7-year-old way of city building. And it's a segregated way, just by definition, it's a segregated way of building your city. We're going to build all this part of the city just with single family houses. Prior to 1950, that was not a thing. That was not a way of thinking. That was not in the vernacular because we didn't build that way. We built a whole variety of housing styles based on market demands. Based on the number of people that wanted to be in that part of town, they would drive a property owner to turn their house into a duplex or to tear down their house and create a fourplex and respond to that market pressure because people wanted to be there, right? And so those neighborhoods naturally grew and changed and created opportunities with a variety of housing styles. That again, we're at a variety of price points, not just because of it being an apartment versus a single family home, but because there may be a a 10-year-old single family home down the street from a 30-year-old single family home. That neighborhood had both those to offer. She had different ways of getting into single family home ownership in that neighborhood. If you look at our neighborhoods today, almost all the homes are the same age. So they're all the same value. So they're all going to represent the same socioeconomic class, right? There's no diversity there. We've regulated it out of existence. And we need to unregulate ourselves back into a diverse way of building cities so that we can encourage diversity across our city. Richard Rothstein in that book, which I encourage everybody to read because it's just healthy reading, but he points out that if we wouldn't have had the laws that caused our society to build in a segregated way and to regulate where people lived in a segregated way, that we would have more naturally integrated. It just would have happened. And over the last 70 years, we would have seen our community becoming much more rich and diverse. But we didn't because of laws that we put into practice. So we're 70 years behind what should have happened naturally. Because we're all learning that there's every reason to appreciate each other, right? But we're just now starting to appreciate that, and we need to start building our cities so that we can start living that way. Thank you.
Yeah, Drew's got a interesting point, and I remember seeing this argued endlessly in Atlanta of a downtown stadium and what does it do to affordable housing. But Drew wants to talk about the Royals and what does that do?
Well, it's a constant narrative, and I don't have a problem with the narrative other than the fact that if you've ever been to Fenway and you understand the huge amount of infrastructure that's required for a downtown stadium, which we don't have in Kansas City, how do we move down this road and continue to have this narrative about a downtown stadium and without having the conversation about the huge effects, number one, on displacement, and number two, on the infrastructure and the taxes that are going to be required to sort of build the infrastructure to support a stadium like that?
Man, I'm glad you brought that up because I have to admit, and I think a lot of people would, that it would be cool to have a downtown stadium. You know, it's just cool to go to a game and walk over to a pub when you're done and, you know, then maybe go to a movie after that. You know, it's just cool having that urban lifestyle. So I appreciate all the interest in that. But what I hope we will do is to weigh that against all the other futures that we could see, because that's a major civic investment. I don't know that all those cool ballparks are actually producing good back to the city in terms of revenue. I know they produce cool, like I just described, so you have that advantage, but I don't know if they're actually a moneymaker for cities. I hope they are because we're spending so much money on them. But I want to know from now on, I want to know every time we're investing as a city that we're doing it towards some public good that we're trying to achieve. And frankly, I'm much more interested today talking about achieving equity and achieving a financially resilient city than I am having another bobble. You know, having another thing just like most every other city now in the country has. Yeah, it'd be cool to have one, but it's not going to make us unique. If we were a productive city that could afford to do more for its citizens than other cities because we paid attention to our books, and if we really had equity as a goal on the top of our list as a city going forward, we could build a unique city, and we could be a model for cities all around the country. If we build another ballpark, we'll be another city with a ballpark. And who knows what liability we'll have for that over the years ahead. But so it's not distinguishing anymore. And I want us to think strategically about how we go forward, because frankly, we don't have a lot of resources left. COVID's only accelerated this problem for us because we're going to be less well off next year and the year after that as a city because of lost revenues. And we were already upside down. So we're not heading in a good direction, and there's no reason to think that when we come out of COVID, all of a sudden we're going to fix all the infrastructure liabilities that we weren't fixing before. So we've got to find a new path forward because the current trajectory is just not healthy and not sustainable. So thank you for asking that question.
Of particularly cities in the U.S., is there an example that we can look to in Kansas City or as Kansas City? Is there an example we can look to as a city that has done this well? You know, maybe a municipality, something like 1 million, 2 million people.
We get that question all the time. And other folks who are talking about this around the country get that question all the time and would love to have a shining, star on the horizon out there. So I'll offer a couple of things you wouldn't think about. I'll offer Lawrence, Kansas. Right, it's not a couple million people by any means, but it's been very concerned about its growth out for many years now. And because of that, they're economically healthier than we are. Now, they have their struggles too, but they haven't faced the same struggles we face because of how much spread out we've done. I'll point now to going down this path of things you wouldn't think about. I'll point to Kansas City, Kansas. Okay, now who would think that's a shining star? But it's a shining star in terms of leadership today. If you drew a spectrum of whatever you want to consider are really healthy, vibrant cities, all the way down to to Detroit, which most of us would recognize as being the most struggling city in our country. In that spectrum, Kansas City is somewhere in the middle, or somewhere in there, but Kansas City, Kansas is very close to Detroit. Because of the extreme level of disinvestment that city has seen and they have to deal with. So just by necessity, the leadership there is having to be much more strategic about real estate policy and investment going forward, because they don't have many options, right? But because they're being more strategic, they're providing good examples that we could learn from. So there are plenty of cities we can learn from. We can learn from Memphis, which struggles more as a city than we are. They're about the same size we are. But they are in a place of governance that is easily 10 or 15 years ahead of us in terms of having had public discussions to get their priorities in place and now leading themselves with metrics, with good practices. That is a hope. It's a hope that we can become that thoughtful about how we go forward as a city. So there are a number of great examples. I wish there was one city in this country that we could point to and say, let's just be them, but we're working on that. It could be Kansas City, but it's going to take a little time.
Sounds good.
Hey, this is why I love these sessions, Randy. I learn something new every week. Dennis, this has been the most educational session of Randy's I've participated in so far. This has been very, very good. My question is this: the 15 laws that you referenced earlier, are those being, how are those being addressed? Are they being addressed aggressively? Are there some things that are happening with those laws to get rid of them, or what's going on there?
Yeah, I'm fairly certain all 15 have been written out of existence.
Okay.
That's
a start.
Yeah, and fair. And, a lot of them were written out of existence 60 years ago.
Oh, okay.
Which doesn't mean that we don't have problems still, right?
That's about the time you and I were born, Dennis.
That's exactly right. So, I mentioned earlier that our zoning laws are still a form of segregation. Now, that's not something we talk about or really think about or even recognize, but we need to start understanding that, because we have, intentionally or not, we have stratified our city into neighborhoods of certain income levels. And thereby restricted folks from other income levels from sharing in the opportunities those communities provide. That is an economic way of segregation. Now it's allowed by law, right? Single family zoning is a legal allowance, but single family zoning allows that phenomenon to happen. So it's a more sophisticated, maybe a more, I won't say covert, but there's another word closer to that, way of maintaining the same segregation that the old blatant laws used to create. So there are other ways that we're still perpetuating problems in our society that we're just learning about and needing to talk about more and figure out how we can change it. And it won't change overnight. but just having the discussions is the important first step. That's going to lead us towards enlightenment and then towards finding ways we can start to move in a more healthy direction going forward.
Yeah, because before this, your presentation today, I was looking at things completely different. So
we all were.
Thank you for the education.
Well, just so you know, I was 4 years ago. So it's not like almost all of us grew up with this being the normal, right? This way of building our city, this way of living, this way of building wealth and owning property is all normal to us because this is what we grew up with. What we don't recognize is it's only normal to us. Prior to us, it's abnormal. 3,000 years prior to us, it's abnormal. And there's a lot of wisdom that was picked up over 3,000 years that we've not paid enough attention to. So now we're into the next enlightenment, I hope, where we can start benefiting from these things and start picking up some of the lessons from the past and build in a more productive and equitable way going forward.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Do these changes we're in the middle of now with work from home and where work moves, do they make this better? Do they take pressure off the infrastructure, or do they help this problem in any way?
They probably do to some degree, measurable maybe, because there's less cars on the road, and that's ultimately what wears down a street. Now there are more people staying at home, so we're flushing those toilets a lot more, so that sewer is not going to last as long. So, there's who knows where the balance falls out there. One thing that our city really I don't see yet, hasn't recognized is how significant the loss in earnings taxes is going to be for the next year and maybe for the future. Because as more people decide to work from home, there's, half of our earnings tax comes from outside of Kansas City, Missouri, from people who live outside of Kansas City, Missouri. And every one of them are keeping tabs on every day they're working at home this year because they're saving money. And Kansas City's not, right? And we need to be preparing for that because that's going to be a new economic reality for our city governance going forward. That's not likely to change, like we were talking about earlier, Randy, that this is going to become part of the new normal, this opportunity to live and work and choose when you come into the office. It's going to be more normal than we ever thought of before. So disruption's underway, and where it ends will be interesting to see.
So I've got this kooky thing that I call it the Emperor of the Universe solutions. So if I were Emperor of the Universe and I was focusing on fixing Kansas City, first thing I'd do is erase the state line. Second thing I would do is create a stronger mayoral system. We have a very weak mayoral system. And through that, I would expect that the mayor would have more control over the taxing methodology, more control over the police, which they have very little direct control, more control over transportation and schools. Everything you've identified in your presentation has all been made worse by the pandemic. Economically, the city of Kansas City, Missouri has been devastated by the loss of revenue. And that's, for mayors to have to deal with that is nothing new. It's just made a whole lot worse. And if we could just centralize the governmental control, forgive me for that, for Kansas City, we're trying to build a sustainable, high-performance city. I think those are the critical elements, and I don't know. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on any one of those.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to respond to both of them because, for one thing, when I mentioned KCK has advantages, their unified government is an advantage, right?
If Carol Marinovich combined the county and city government together, and
Right. So
created the West Village as a result.
well, that single form of governance helps them tremendously. Their decision making is much more nimble and can be much more uniform. You know, they can operate as one. Our city, our metropolitan, doesn't have that advantage. The state line's the biggest version of it, but then you subdivide us into all the counties that are part of this metro. Each of those create their own perspective. And you lay all that together, and we've got a messy soup of politics. So that's what takes me to the second part of it. I personally feel like there's too much politicking in the governing side of our economy today. So I don't know whether a strong mayor or a strong city manager, but certainly strong leadership is needed in all levels of government. Because that's what we hire people to do in government, is to lead. But we've become politically oriented, and we've lost sight of leadership. So I agree, we need strong leadership here in our city. And whatever form it takes, I'm all for it, but we need it. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Well, great job, Dennis. I really appreciate it. That was very informative. Yeah, a lot of applause here. Small box applause. Yeah.
Thanks again for the opportunity, Randy, and for everybody for their time today. Let us know if you know of any other situations where this message might have an impact or might be appreciated for discussion, because we're trying to do this as often as we can because of the need to have these discussions.